All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated, veuillez vous asseoir.
Welcome back, Mrs. Nowry. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the next part, Mr. Jacobs will be making the presentation, which will bear on the contextual elements of crimes against humanity and part of responsibility. Thank you.
Please.
Monsieur le Président, Madame, Monsieur le juge,
Mr. President, Your Honors,
comme nous venons de le démontrer,
as we have just
l'accusation est-elle
established,
incapable de démontrer
the prosecution
l'existence de l'élément
is
contextuel des crimes
unable
de guerre,
to establish the existence of the contextual
Principalement
elements of war
parce qu'elle est
crimes,
incapable de démontrer
particularly because
qu'il appelle
it is
la
unable
Seleka
to demonstrate that what it
pourrait
refers to
constituer un
as
groupe
Seleka
suffisamment structuré,
can
organisé,
constitute a
hiérarchisé,
sufficiently
au sens de
structured,
l'article 8.
organized, and hierarchical group in the meaning of Article 8 of the statutes. Of the
Les
statute.
arguments de l'accusation portant sur l'élément contextuel
Prosecution
des crimes contre
arguments
l'humanité échouent
relating to crimes against
pour les mêmes
humanity fail for this very same reasons.
L'accusation a l'obligation de démontrer
The onus is on the
l'existence d'une
prosecution to
politique
demonstrate
d'un
the
État ou
existence
d'une
of a
organisation.
policy by a state or by an organization.
Et force est de constater,
We must
à la lecture
note,
du DCC
as
et
we
du
read the
PCB,
DCC and
ne
the
le fait
PCB, that the prosecutor never establishes that.
sur ce point,
On this point,
l'accusation évoque une politique
prosecutor
conçue par la Seleka
alludes to a policy
exécutée
that
par
was
des
designed by
fonctionnaires
Seleka
et des
and
éléments
implemented
du
by
gouvernement de
civil
la Seleka.
servants and elements of the Seleka government,
Paragraphe 68
paragraph
du
68
PCB.
of the PCB.
L'on voit ici encore
Here, once
que
again,
le procureur
we
se
see
cache
that
derrière
the
le
prosecutor
concept
takes shelter
monolithique
behind
de
the
Seleka,
monolithic concept of Seleka,
qui ne recouvre
which
aucune
does
réalité,
not cover
ce qui
any
sera notre
reality,
premier point.
and that will be our first point.
Le procureur ne démontre pas
The
plus l'existence
prosecutor
d'une politique,
fails to establish the existence of a
ce qui
policy,
sera notre second point.
and that will be our second point.
Le procureur ne démontre pas non
The
plus
prosecutor also
ce
fails
que recouvre cette
to
idée vague de
establish
gouvernement de la
what
Seleka,
this vague idea of Seleka
Ce qui sera
government
notre troisième
entails,
point.
and that will be our third point.
Enfin, et ce sera notre
Finally,
quatrième point de cette présentation,
the fourth
nous
point
tirerons
of
les
our
conséquences
presentation will be
de
one
cette
in which
absence
we
de
draw the
démonstration
consequences of
sur la
this lack
faiblesse de
of
l'argumentation de l'accusation
a demonstration
concernant la
and the
responsabilité de M.
weakness of the prosecution argument in relation to the liability of Mr. Said.
Comme nous l'avons démontré,
As we have already established,
la Seleka n'a jamais existé comme
Seleka
une entité homogène,
never existed as a homogeneous
l'arrivée à
entity, neither before
encore
the
moins
arrival in Bangui or even less so thereafter.
À cette époque,
At that
la
time,
coalition déjà
the
hétérogène
coalition was
et peu
already a
organisée,
heterogeneous
qui était
and
entrée
poorly
dans Bangui dans le
organized
seul but de faire tomber le
body
gouvernement
that entered
antidémocratique
Bangui
du
with the
président
lone
Bozizé
goal to overthrow the anti-democratic
s'est
government of
complètement
President
fragmentée
Bozizé, and that it was
dissoute
completely
groupuscules
fragmented and splintered
lutte
into
d'influence
small
permanente.
groups, replete with permanent power struggles.
Des groupuscules surtout mus par la volonté
And
de
that such
récolter
groups
les
had
fruits pécuniers de
one
la
main
prise de Bangui.
purpose, that is to gain pecuniary gains from the capture of Bangui.
L'ONU résume parfaitement
The United Nations
atmosphère de
provides
chaos
a perfect
généralisé.
summary of this atmosphere of generalized chaos.
Et je renvoie à la pièce
And I want to refer
CAROTP
to document
2034
CAROTP 2034
02
0270
paragraphe
at page
41.
at paragraph 41.
La Seleka s'est révélée comme
Seleka emerged
plus une
as being
composition de
more
blocs
of a
en
composition
recherche
of
de leur
blocks
intérêt
seeking
individuel,
personal interests
essayant de trouver des ressources
and trying
personnelles
to find personal
plutôt qu'un
resources
gouvernement
rather
avec un
than
agenda
a
politique clair.
government with a clear political agenda.
Faire partir Bozizé du pouvoir semblait être la seule stratégie.
It appears that this
Initier les
only
anciens
strategy of Seleka was to get Bozize out of power, and that is why
La
those
Seleka
former
demeure une
groups
entité non
rallied
homogène,
together.
avec des soldats qui prennent les
Seleka
instructions de leur
is
propre
a
commandant.
non-homogeneous
Fin de citation.
organization with soldiers taking orders from their own commanders. End of quote.
Le secrétaire général des Nations Unies,
The Secretary General
quant à
of the
lui,
United
noté en mai
Nations
2013,
in May 2013 pointed out as
je
follows,
renvoie à la pièce
and I'm referring
499
to
de notre inventaire,
document
paragraphe 34.
499 at paragraph 34.
Les dissensions se sont aggravées au sein de la
There was
coalition
increasing
et les dirigeants ont du mal à contrôler leurs
dissension
propres
between
éléments.
within the coalition, and leaders had
Les
difficulty
combattants de
controlling
la
their
Seleka
members.
refusent d'être cantonnés.
Seleka combatants refused to be billeted,
De plus,
and furthermore,
les tensions entre les différentes
there
factions de
were
la coalition
persistent
persistent
tensions between the various factions of the coalition,
et chacun cherche à recruter
and
davantage
each
d'éléments,
faction tried to recruit more elements,
ce qui accroît le risque
thereby
de confrontation
increasing the risk
généralisée
of
entre eux.
generalized conflict between themselves.
Fin de citation.
End of quote.
Dans le même sens,
Similarly,
le IPIS, International
IPIS,
Peace Information Service,
the International Peace Information Service,
estime que, dès la prise de Bangui,
believes that
les
once
motivations des
Bangui
Seleka
fell,
sont devenues
the
essentiellement de
motivations
nature
of
financière
Seleka became essentially financial in nature
et décrit un comportement prédateur
and
dirigé vers
describes
le gain à court
a
terme.
predatory conduct
le
that,
pillage et les
that
braquages.
was seeking short-term gain through pillaging and robbery.
Et je renvoie à la pièce
I refer
CAROTP
you to CAROTP
57
2001
39,
5739
page
at page
57-81.
5781.
Dans ces circonstances,
In these circumstances, therefore,
force est de constater
it must be noted
qu'évoquer une politique
that
décidée par la
reference to a
Seleka
policy
n'a pas grand
decided
sens
upon by Seleka does not have much meaning,
et qu'à l'aune de la réalité qui
and
prévalait
that
sur le terrain à ce
mindful
moment-là,
of the reality on the ground at the time,
toutes les affirmations
all
du
the
procureur
assertions by the
portant sur cette
prosecutor
soi-disant politique
relating to this so-called
prennent un sens
policy,
complètement différent.
therefore must be understood in a completely different meaning.
Par exemple,
For example,
l'accusation s'appuie
the
pour
prosecution
donner l'impression
relies,
d'une organisation
with a view to
hiérarchisée
give the impression that there was a hierarchical organization in place, relies on what they refer to as the presence of high officials of the
par
Seleka
exemple,
on the
paragraphe
ground.
77 de son
And you
PCB.
can find this at paragraph 77 of the PCB.
Or, comme nous l'avons déjà
But
dit,
we have already
les grades utilisés par les
demonstrated
individus
that the ranks that were
ne veulent
used
rien
by individuals had no
et
significance
surtout ne disent rien
and did not in
quelle
any way
organisation
reflect
globale ou
any
générale,
global
quelconque hiérarchie.
or general organization with a hierarchy in place.
Chaque petit chef de bande,
Each
s'autoproclamant
small
général,
gang leader
colonel,
self-proclaimed themselves
se faisant
general
appeler de
or
la
colonel and
avec quelques
were
hommes qui
referred to as such by the few men that were under them.
comme le notait le témoin
Witness
P64,
P0234 pointed out, and I quote from his statement, 2005-5407 at paragraph 47, around August 2013, there was really a problem of statehood. There were several parallel command chains in place. There was no control. Almost all the Selekas were colonels or generals. I can describe the situation as being one of a generalized disobedience and an unchecked quest for wearing ranks. End of quote. In the same manner, what the prosecutor refers to as the orders given by these self-proclaimed colonels and generals were not part of a policy or a general strategy, but were clearly, if one reads the witness statements themselves, they were rather part of the activities of looting and violence, which were part of the interests and pecuniary gain that motivated these small gang leaders. The example provided by the prosecutor yesterday during the hearing is a good illustration of this point. He referred to the rape of a victim following orders from a military leader of Seleka, and I refer you to the real-time transcript page 65, lines 17 and 18. Mr. President, I will quote part of the witness statement, and I'm not sure there is any part that might identify the witness, but just out of an abundance of caution, maybe we should go into private session.
Well, that is fine. Mr. Court Officer, let's go into private session, please.
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Mr. Counsel, please continue.
Cet exemple montre en réalité l'absence complète de
This
sens
example points to the total
qu'il faut
absence
donner au soi-disant grade
of
militaire
the meaning
auto-attribué
that
par
should
certains
be ascribed to the so-called
Au lieu de
military
répondre au
ranks
premier
that
degré,
were
sans aucun recul,
proclaimed by
comme le fait
certain
l'accusateur.
individuals, rather than proceed in the manner in which the prosecution has done.
Dans ces circonstances, il convient que nous constations
Under these
si la
circumstances,
réalité
therefore,
que
we must
l'accusation refuse de voir.
point out the reality that the prosecution refuses
Les
to see.
événements dont parle le procureur,
The events that the prosecutor
et
is
pour autant
referring
qu'ils soient
to,
établis,
although they may have been
relèvent de
established,
criminalité ordinaire,
are events that speak to an ordinary
Marqués par des
acts of
pillages.
criminality characterized by
dans le cadre d'une désorganisation complète
pillaging
et d'anarchie générale.
within a context of total disorganization and generalized anarchy.
Confronté au fait que ces pillages
When challenged on the fact that
constituent
these
l'essentiel de
pillages
l'activité d'individus
were the
difficiles à contrôler,
events that were carried out by individuals who could
et que le
not be
moteur de ces
controlled,
individus est l'appât du gain,
and that the motive of these individuals was gain and not a general policy,
l'accusation continue à
the
être dans le
prosecutor
déni de la réalité.
continues to deny that reality
Et continue de vouloir faire rentrer,
he fails to draw
faire rentrer les faits dans son fantasme d'une
the-
politique générale.
he continues to try to
Comment?
insert these facts into his imaginary general policy.
En essayant de transformer ces pillages,
How does he do that? By
rappelons-le,
trying
non
to
visés
transform
par le statut de
these
Rome, dans le
pillages,
cadre de
which
l'article 7,
we must say are not covered by
En droit
Article
international.
7 of the Rome Statute, by trying to transform them, therefore, into international
je
crimes.
renvoie au paragraphe 89 du
I
PCB.
refer you to paragraph 89 of the PCB.
Le procureur veut donc absolument
The
transformer
prosecutor,
son dossier
therefore, absolutely wants to transform his
qui expose
case,
en creux la criminalité de droit commun
which
rampante en République centrafricaine
deals with the
en un
prevailing
dossier de crime
common
international.
criminality in Central African Republic. He wants to transform that into
Mais ce n'est pas la
a
fonction de la
case
Cour pénale
on
internationale
international
de
crimes.
s'intéresser à la criminalité
It
de
is
droit
not the
commun.
function of the International Criminal Court to deal with common criminality.
Les événements à Boyrab dans le courant de 2013
The events that took place in Boyarab in 2013, which the prosecutor refers to, are consonant with this idea of common criminality and pillaging,
à part les
or
affrontements
ordinary
sporadiques
criminality. Apart from these, the sporadic
en
clashes
avril et en août
between
2013,
former FACA
dont nous
soldiers
avons déjà
in
parlé,
April and August 2013, we have already referred
qui
to
ressort
this.
de l'analyse de la preuve du procureur
When one analyzes the
de son
prosecutor's
pillage à des fins
evidence,
personnelles,
we see that it
des actes
deals
de
mainly
violence
with
aléatoires.
pillaging for personal gain and isolated, indiscriminate acts of violence.
Chaque témoin du procureur décrit
Each prosecution
les pilleurs ont
witness
emporté des matelas,
has described how
des tables, du bétail,
the
des frigo,
pillaging persons took away mattresses, televisions, chairs, tables, and
renvoie par
cattle
exemple
and
à la
fridges.
déclaration antérieure de P,
I refer you to P0940,
P500
P0500,
ou P1524.
and P1524.
Le fait est que ces pillages à des fins personnelles
In fact, this pillaging for personal gain
constituent le cœur de l'activité
was
des
at
personnes,
the
des
very
personnes en
heart
question,
of the activities undertaken by
et
the
répondaient à
persons
une
in
volonté de
question,
satisfaire
and were
des fins
simply part
personnelles,
of a desire to
sans
meet
découler du
personal
quelconque
needs
politique ou
and did
d'instruction.
not flow from any particular policy or follow any instructions.
Au contraire, la preuve du procureur
The contrary is that prosecution evidence itself shows that these people did not obey any orders, even from those whom the prosecutor claims were leaders. For example, P0851 says as follows, and I quote, "When we arrived at my place, the Seleka pointed their weapons at us and asked who we were. Noureddin Adan introduced himself to them, but they didn't stop pillaging. Noureddin Adam told them, 'Do not pillage the residence.'" End of quote. And I refer you to statement by P0851, CROTP 2027 0194. Paragraph 32. Another example to illustrate this point, P1970 talks of a Seleka which, I quote, "who was killed by another Seleka member as they were fighting over looted or pillaged objects." Reference, prior statement, 2070-0995 at paragraph 34. So we see clearly here that the actions committed took place in an entirely disorganized and chaotic environment, so much so that the so-called Seleka elements killed each other over pillaged goods. So, where is the policy and where is the organization in all this? In this context, it is therefore not surprising that the prosecutor fails to establish a policy targeting supporters of President Bouzize. In the PCB, the prosecutor claims at paragraph 49 that there was a policy in place targeting the civilian population in Bangui who were considered to be supporters of Bouzize. End of quote. This attack was committed by Seleka pursuant to the application and in furtherance of a state policy which had as purpose to attack those persons based on their characteristics, which, according to them, demonstrated or pointed to their allegiance to Bouzize. End of quote there. So the prosecutor's approach has several methodological shortcomings which we must highlight here. First of all, the prosecutor's approach fails on grounds of selection of the various examples it relies on, because those grounds are based on a prioris that have not been established, namely the existence of a policy. And it is a bias that operates at two levels. First of all,
parce que l'accusation est partie d'un présupposé
the prosecutor
démontré
assumes
qu'il existait une politique,
that there was a policy
elle
in
n'a
place,
sélectionné que des exemples
but
de
this has
personnes
not been demonstrated.
qui permettraient de
And
valider à
he
rebours
proceeds to select an example
l'existence de cette
of
politique.
persons who would then backtrack in establishing or validating the existence of such a policy.
On voit bien ici les limites de
We can
l'exercice.
therefore see here how limited the exercise is, because by proceeding in this manner, the prosecutor consciously excludes from his case anything that is contrary or counter to his own narrative.
D'ailleurs, illustrant ce procédé,
By the way, to illustrate this
le
point,
procureur se garde bien
the prosecutor
de donner le
simply
moindre chiffre
abstains
sur
from
la
providing
population carcérale de
any
l'OCRB
figures
pendant toute la période des charges.
whatsoever relating to the number of people incarcerated at the OCRB throughout the period charged.
Le procureur se garde bien de dire, comme on
The
l'a vu,
prosecutor
que les détenus à
abstains
l'OCRB sont
from
majoritairement
saying
des délinquants de droit commun,
or
souvent
that
d'anciens Seleka.
the detainees at OCRDB were simply common law criminals, most of whom were former Seleka.
Et c'est bien normal que le
And this is
procureur ne donne
normal
pas ces chiffres.
for the prosecutor to abstain from providing these figures and these
Jusqu'alors, ce serait la
details,
preuve objective,
because in so
chiffrée,
doing, it will
inattaquable,
provide an objective,
de l'absence de
quantified,
politique
unquestionable
et du caractère
evidence
isolé
of the
des exemples
absence of a
donnés dans le
policy
PCB.
and of the isolated nature of the examples provided in the PCB.
Toujours parce qu'elle a pris pour point de départ le
Now,
présupposé
the
non démontré
prosecutor starts by
qu'il existait
assuming,
une politique,
without demonstrating it, that a policy was in place, hereby clearly proceeding or putting the cart before the horse.
elle a identifié les
The
caractéristiques des
prosecutor
personnes
identified the
qu'elle estimait
characteristics
être
of
victimes
persons
de cette soi-disant
whom
politique.
he deemed to be victims of the so-called policy,
Pour ensuite affirmer que
and
parce
then
que ces
would go on
victimes
to
auraient
assert
ces
that
caractéristiques,
because those victims were so
la politique devait
characterized,
viser
the
ces
policy
personnes et
therefore
ces
must have
caractéristiques.
targeted the persons who had those characteristics.
Encore une fois, l'avantage pour
Once again,
l'application de cette approche
Such
circulaire
a circular approach for the prosecutor has the advantage that he is not then expected to demonstrate that the policy was actually a reality.
les failles de l'approche du procureur sur ce point
The holes or shortcomings in the prosecutor's approach are not only methodological but also factual.
En effet, si on met
In
ensemble
fact,
les
if we
populations
put together
qui, d'après le procureur, auraient
the
été ciblées,
people who, according
cela
to the
recouvre la grande
prosecutor,
majorité de la
were
population
targeted,
centrafricaine.
that would amount to the vast majority of the population of the
80%
Central African
de
Republic,
chrétiens en République
because
centrafricaine.
there are 90% Christians in
Que
the
les trois ethnies
Central African Republic,
que l'accusation
and
évoquée
the
par
ethnic
l'accusation dans son
groups
PCB,
mentioned by the
Baya, Manja ou Banda,
prosecution in the PCB, namely the Baya, the Manja, and the Banda,
constituent près de
make up
75% de la
about
population centrafricaine.
75% of the Central African Republic population.
En d'autres termes, cela veut dire que statistiquement,
This means, in other words, that
pour le dire simplement, si
statistically,
une personne décède à
and
Bangui,
putting
quelle
it
que soit la
simply,
raison,
if someone were to die in Bangui for whatever reason,
il y a de grandes chances qu'elle fasse partie de l'un des groupes
it
dont
is
parle le
very likely that they would belong to one of the groups that the prosecutor has referred to.
Par conséquent, affirmer
Consequently,
que les victimes alléguées
To
feraient
assert
partie de ce
that
groupe
the alleged victims were part of
ne démontre
a certain group
statistiquement rien
does
qui
not
concerne l'existence d'une politique
statistically
visant ce groupe.
demonstrate or establish that there was a policy in place targeting that particular group.
La démarche de l'accusation
The prosecutor's
souffre
approach
donc d'une confusion
clearly,
évidente,
therefore, reflects a
corrélation et
confusion
causalité,
between correlation and causality,
Puisque pour l'accusation,
Because, according to the prosecutor,
toute personne qui se
anybody
trouverait dans certaines religions, par
who
exemple,
would
serait forcément ciblée
belong
en raison
to
de
a
son
certain
appartenance à
religious
cette
group
religion.
will necessarily be targeted because of their belonging to that particular religious group.
Une fois encore, un tel raccourci
And once again,
permet au
such
procureur de ne rien avoir à
a
démontrer.
logical shortcut puts the prosecutor in a position where he does not have to establish anything.
Sur ce point, il est intéressant de
On
rappeler
that point,
qu'hier, en
it is
l'occurrence,
important to point out that yesterday, during the hearing,
c'est la représentante légale des victimes
it is the legal representative of victims who contradicted the prosecutor's narrative
puisqu'elle nous a expliqué que les
when
victimes
she explained
participantes
to
dans
us
ce dossier n'avaient,
that
selon elle,
the victims
pas grand-chose en
participating in this case did not have much
étaient
in common
d'origine ethnique
and that
diverse.
they were from diverse ethnic origins.
Je renvoie au transcrit
I
real-time
refer to real-time transcript
d'hier,
of
page
yesterday,
3,
page 3,
ligne 28.
line 28 to page 4, line 1.
Troisièmement et dernier biais méthodologique,
Third and last methodological bias.
la démarche du procureur souffre de sauts logiques
The
rédhibitoires.
prosecutor's approach has prohibitive logical jumps.
En effet, même à accepter les déclarations des témoins
Even
d'accusation,
if we were to accept the statements by prosecution witnesses, whereby during the pillaging, some of the pillagers mentioned their alleged the alleged allegiance of victims to Francois Bozizé, that in itself does not demonstrate the existence of a policy. It is not because several people do the same thing that they have together adopted a policy to do so, or that they received any orders to do so. The onus is on the prosecutor to establish that these isolated incidents are not the product of personal animosity. So the logical jump here cannot be accepted within a judicial trial, especially when it comes from the prosecutor on whom the onus lies to establish the charges, and who does not need to convince the judges to take as a given that which has not been established. The only location in the PCB where one might have thought that the prosecutor would provide elements to demonstrate maybe the existence of a policy is the section where it is stated before paragraph 78 as follows. The Seleka publicly recognized that it was conducting a policy targeting the alleged supporters of Bozizé. Once again, let us look at the use of the generic term Seleka in this context. When we read the examples provided by the prosecutor, we note that once again we are dealing with isolated cases, mostly individual cases, or prosecution witnesses alleging that their interlocutors blamed them for being, or apparently blamed them for being Bozizé supporters. Once again, this does not establish a policy.
Le témoignage de P.
The testimony of P1289,
auquel l'accusation renvoie en note de bas de page 224,
referred to by the prosecutor
illustre parfaitement ce
footnote
point.
at page 224, perfectly illustrates this point.
Certes, P1289 allège que la personne
P1289
qui l'aurait arrêté
alleges that the person who allegedly arrested him blamed him apparently for being a Bozize
Mais le
supporter.
témoin ajoute immédiatement
But immediately thereafter, the witness adds as follows, and I
sur la
quote,
route, il m'a confié qu'il
"On the
venait du
road,
Tchad.
he confided to me that he came from Chad and that he had helped Bozize during
Bozize ne les
his
avait
coup
pas
d'etat,
récompensés.
but that Bozize had not compensated them."
Et je renvoie ici
I
à la
refer
déclaration
you
antérieure,
to
21,
prior
27,
statement 2127,
76, 32,
76, 32,
paragraphe 42,
paragraph
et 43.
42 and 43.
L'on voit bien ici que
So we see here clearly
l'individu qui
that
aura
the individual who
P1289
allegedly arrested
exprime non pas
P1289
une politique
speaks
générale,
not in terms of a general policy,
mais bien un ressentiment
but
personnel
expresses a
d'avoir pas été
personal
récompensé
feeling
d'avoir soutenu
for not
démocratie
having
François Bozize.
been compensated for having previously supported President Francois Bozize.
Au paragraphe 79,
At paragraph
du PCB,
79 of the PCB,
l'accusation affirme
the
que,
prosecutor asserts that,
je cite,
and I quote,
Adam et Jotoja
Adam and
ont également
Jotoja
prononcé des discours à la radio
also delivered
mentionné
speeches
boy rap,
on the
ses
radio
habitants,
talking about
d'une
boy
manière
rap
propre à faire
and
naître
its
chez eux la peur panique
inhabitants
d'une attaque
in a manner that would raise fear and panic as regards an imminent attack. End of quote.
On s'attend alors à ce que le procureur
One would
renvoie
have expected
ces
then
supposés discours.
that the prosecutor would refer to those alleged
Mais ce n'est pas le cas.
speeches, but that does not happen.
Ce n'est pas le cas.
That's not the
Le
case.
procureur renvoie au
The
témoignage d'un
prosecutor
unique témoin
refers to the testimony of a single witness
qui affirme avoir entendu
who
un unique discours,
affirms that they heard a single speech on the
qui
radio
donne sa propre perception
and
de ce discours.
who provides their personal interpretation or perception of the speech.
C'est le témoin P.
The witness I'm referring to is P100 0100
KROTP
CROTP 2118
63
6331
paragraphe 39.
at paragraph 39.
Où est donc ce discours?
So where is this speech?
Nous ne le savons pas.
We do not know.
Où sont au final ces fameux discours publics
Where are
dont parle
those
l'accusation?
public speeches that the prosecutor has
Nulle part
referred
dans le
to?
dossier.
They cannot be found in the case file.
L'on peut donc constater que l'accusation, une fois encore,
One therefore notes that once
affirme
again,
sans démontrer
the prosecutor makes
N'apporte aucun
assertions
élément
without demonstrating
au soutien de ces
and does
allégations.
not provide any evidence in support of his
Il n'a pas démontré
allegations
l'existence d'une
and
quelconque
therefore
politique.
finally fails to demonstrate the existence of any kind of policy whatsoever.
J'en viens à la question du
I now
fameux gouvernement
turn
de
to the
Seleka.
issue of the
Car
famous
l'accusation est une
or
honte,
infamous
donc aucune
Seleka
réalité.
government, which in fact does not
Nous l'avons déjà
encompass
vu.
any
Je n'y reviens pas en détail.
kind of
Il n'existe
reality.
pas de gouvernement de
We
la Seleka.
have already established, and I'm not going to return to
Et à
that
cette
point, that
époque,
there was no Seleka
Un
government in
gouvernement de
place.
transition
At the
nationale
time, there was a national transition government in place,
qui inclut des personnalités
which was made up of
tout le spectre politique
personalities
africain,
drawn
de la
from
société
the
civile,
entire spectrum of the Central African political scene as well as from civil society,
qui qui s'inscrit dans les suites
and
des
which
accords de Libreville,
was
la
set up
constante coopération
after
avec
the
la communauté
Libreville
internationale.
Agreement and in constant cooperation with the international community.
Par exemple, le témoin P2328
Witness P2328, for example,
décrit la coopération
describes the
entre le
cooperation
gouvernement de
between
transition
the transitional
et le
government
bureau local de l'ONU
and the local
pour cantonner les éléments
office
de la
of the
Seleka.
UN in billeting the Seleka elements.
Je renvoie à sa déclaration
I
antérieure,
refer to that prior statement
donc c'est P2328,
by P2328,
CAR-OTP,
reference CAROTP 2099 0165.
Paragraphe 255.
At paragraph 255.
Surtout, ce que le procureur omet de préciser
Now,
par rapport à notre conversation
what the
précise,
prosecutor
c'est que des poursuites
says in relation to
ont été
our
engagées
conversation is that
contre les pilleurs et délinquants se revendiquant de la Seleka,
charges were
après
brought
les événements
against
de Boira.
pillars and delinquents of the Seleka movement, particularly after the violence in Boyarab.
Ces poursuites ont fait l'objet d'une couverture médiatique.
These cases were covered in the media,
Et je renvoie aux pièces
and I want to refer to
CAR-OTP
document CROTP 2023 1016
5424
2005 55 24
2005
2005
26
54 26
2005
20
54 22
06 55
et la pièce
22.
498 de notre inventaire de preuves.
and document 428 on our list 498 on our list of evidence.
Ces poursuites ont été documentées par les ONG.
NGOs covered these prosecutions,
Et je renvoie notamment
and
à
I
un rapport de
refer
la FIDH
to an FIDH report 2001 2890.
et ressort des déclarations des témoins de l'accusation
From the
dans une
statements
position d'autorité.
of prosecution witnesses who were in position of authority, let me refer to witness P 0234, for example.
Le procureur dispose même d'éléments matériels
The prosecution is even in possession of material, concrete and official material that
24
testifies
PV d'audition
to these
des autorités
prosecutions.
centrafricaines portant sur les
24
individus
reports from the
sur
Central
Seleka.
African prosecution
Nous les avons tous.
regarding these
Je renvoie aux
prosecutions.
pièces 197 à 220
All have these documents, and I refer to documents 197 to 220 for this purpose.
de notre... je renvoie aux pièces 197 à 220 de
So,
inventaire.
documents 197 to 220 on our list of evidentiary material.
Tous ces éléments sont complètement ignorés par l'accusation.
All this evidence is totally set aside by the prosecutor. And the prosecutor, whenever reality doesn't dovetail with his narrative, he simply ignores it.
Il convient donc de constater que sur cette question,
Therefore, we must note that on this matter, as on others, there is a prosecutor on the one hand who wishes that the existence of a state or a policy or an organization which is not established should be accepted as such. And then on the other hand, we have concrete material, documentary, tangible evidence which points exactly to the opposite. Therefore, from the prosecutor's own evidence, it emerges that if there was a state policy in place, it was, as could be at all, one that would deal with a chaotic situation which simply aimed at disarming individuals who claimed to be Seleka and then to prosecute them following judicial processes in relation to the crimes committed.
à ce stade de la démonstration, Monsieur le Président,
At this juncture, Mr. President, of my presentation, I would like to say that clearly it emerges that the two pillars on which the prosecution case hinges do collapse, particularly allegations pertaining to war crimes and allegations pertaining to crimes against humanity. The prosecution has failed to demonstrate that there was an armed conflict of an international character and fails to establish that there was a policy in place within the context of an organization. In these circumstances, and as if it were a domino effect, it is only normal, therefore, for the allegations of the prosecutor against Mr. Said to also naturally collapse. We have already established that in a context where the state was disorganized, the OCRB did what it could to carry out its functions of fighting against banditry and delinquency. We have established that the persons detained at the OCRB were persons involved in acts of common law or ordinary criminality. We established that the OCRB contributed at its level to the fight against pillaging that was being committed in Seleka by former Selekas in Bangui, and this was pointed out, by the way, by the FIDH. In fact, FIDH, in its report CAR OTP 2001-2890, clearly indicates that the persons who were prosecuted, that is, the Seleka individuals who had pillaged in Boyarab in August, that those individuals were detained at the OCRB. This is at page 2933. In this context, therefore, the mission of the OCRB was one of participating in missions to maintain peace and order. It was therefore only normal for Mr. Said to volunteer to help Mazenge, who was understaffed, as we have mentioned, and to participate in the management in order to ensure that those working at OCRB would have food and that they would have the necessary resources to carry out their missions or their mission of maintaining peace and order. It is only normal that in so doing, Mr. Said would have participated as a volunteer in the receiving and sorting of persons who were arrested. When it comes to the allegations of excesses, sometimes based on doubtful and contradictory evidence, as we will point out subsequently, beyond that, let us now look at what the prosecutor's evidence itself establishes. We are dealing with isolated cases, opportunistic acts that follow no logic, that are incoherent and are disorganized, that are such that there is violence between alleged perpetrators, and these are the reasons for these acts of violence and frequency thereof. It is also frequently clear that the motivation of the various actors is financial. As they seek to obtain money from the family or for the family. Therefore, from the prosecution evidence, it is clear that nothing establishes that these ultimately isolated facts covering the entire period of the charges was part of a general policy, were part of a general policy. And that is the key here at the ICC. This conduct may not be desirable, obviously not, but do they amount to elements of an international crime? Once again, the answer is no. Because these isolated acts clearly do not fall under a general policy, and that is why the prosecutor has failed to establish the material elements and modes of liability pertaining thereto. For example, the prosecutor, dealing with issues of policy and organization in relation to the contextual element of the crime against humanity, the prosecutor does not even attempt to establish that there was a common plan which Mr. Said was part of. The establishment of a common plan is a condition sine qua non. It's a key element pertaining to the modes of liability under Article 25(3)(a), which is dealing with indirect co-perpetration. Therefore, once again, the prosecutor relies on the same process whereby he chooses not to establish anything, but simply invites the chamber to deduct from the common plan that crimes existed. I refer to paragraph 203 of the PCB. Mr. President, Your Honors, everything I have said a short while ago about the circular nature of the prosecutor's methodology and the policy, all of that applies here as well, because the prosecutor does not demonstrate or establish anything. He simply presupposes that crimes arose from a common plan, and because they were crimes, there was a common plan in place. But that is not established logically. It is therefore very clear that the prosecutor has failed to establish that there was a policy in place, that there was an organization in place, and quite naturally, therefore, we can come to the conclusion that there was no common plan in place either. In these circumstances, and mindful of this fundamental gap in the prosecutor's methodology, this absence of establishment of a policy which the prosecutor never has failed to establish, never demonstrated that Seleka or demonstrated what Seleka is. There is no need, therefore, to revisit each of the items of modes of liability that have been raised by the prosecutor. But let me make at least two quick comments, particularly in response to the prosecution's statement of yesterday. First of all, we must question the general status or quality of the prosecution witnesses, particularly those whom the prosecutor calls insider witnesses. And Mr. President, for purposes of dealing with this matter, I would call for a private session.
Mr. Court Officer,
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. You can continue, Mr. Counsel.
Deuxièmement, la Chambre a constaté qu'une grande partie des allégations
Secondly,
formulées
the
par
chamber
l'accusation
would
contre M.
note
Saïd
that most of the allegations brought against Mr. Said rely on one source, and quite often that one source provides anonymous hearsay.
ce que se garde bien de dire le procureur dans son PCB.
But the prosecutor does not disclose that fact in his PCB.
Prenons un exemple.
Let's take one example.
L'accusation indiquait en audience hier que
Yesterday, during the hearing, the prosecutor mentioned that witness P0853
était, a dit, et je cite, le témoin P0853
said the following.
M. Saïd était présent
P0853
dormait même au CEDAD.
remembered that Mr. Said was present with him regularly at Seyad and even spent the night at Sedad.
Et je renvoie au transcrit
End of
time.
quote. Reference real-time transcript of yesterday, 12 October 2021,
page 84,
page 84,
lignes 26 et 27.
line 26 and 27.
On peut imaginer que le procureur
So one can
considère que
imagine
P853 est
that
un bon témoin.
the prosecutor takes P0853 to be
Dans une
a good
présentation
witness
relativement courte, il choisit de le
because
mettre en lumière
in a very
pour nous,
short
de le
presentation,
mentionner.
he highlights and mentions this particular witness for us.
Or, que nous dit le témoin?
But what does the witness tell us?
Et je renvoie à sa déclaration
I refer
ultérieure,
to his prior statement, 21-27.
96 01. Pardon, je recommence, excusez-moi.
I'm sorry, let me repeat the number. 21-27, 96-97.
Et je cite paragraphe 21.
And I quote paragraph 21.
Saïd était toujours au CEDAD.
Said was always at Sedad. He would even spend the night there
C'est ce que
sometimes.
m'ont dit
That is what I was told. That is what I was told. By some
la garde pendant la nuit.
Seleka elements who were on guard at night and who knew him.
Il nous semble que ce soit une légère déformation
It would seem to us that this is a slight
qui rapporte un oui-dire de
deformation
dire de quelque
of
chose.
a witness's statement, who the witness having said that he heard, and now it's being said that he remembered, whereas he wasn't even present. That's the distortion.
D'ailleurs,
By the way,
de bas de page 875
at
de son
footnote
PCB,
875 of the PCB,
l'accusation prétend corroborer ce témoin
the prosecution
parlé
claims to corroborate
rapporte un oui-dire
this witness, whom we have talked about as providing hearsay evidence,
139.
corroborating that with the evidence of witness P839.
Qui est donc ce témoin qui
So,
peut se prononcer sur
who
le rôle allégué de M. Saïd au
is
CEDAD?
this witness who can make statements on the alleged role of Mr. Said at the Sedad?
Un témoin qui énonce clairement, et je cite,
A witness who clearly states as follows, and I quote,
je ne suis jamais
I
allé à la CEDAD moi-même.
have never gone to the CEDAD myself.
Et je renvoie à sa déclaration antérieure.
And I refer to his prior statement, KOTP 2127 9790.
Paragraphe 18.
9780, correction, paragraph 18.
Voici donc la preuve, Monsieur le Président, Madame, Monsieur les juges, que l'accusation
Mr.
est
President,
solide,
Your Honors, this is the evidence that the prosecutor thinks is the most solid in his case file, because we are talking in a hearing about a witness who provides anonymous hearsay, and a witness who has never even visited CEDAD.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
Madame, Monsieur les juges, permettez-moi de conclure.
Your Honors, I would like to conclude
Une phrase bien connue d'Albert Camus.
by quoting a well-known phrase of Albert Camus.
Mal nommer un objet, c'est
If
ajouter au malheur du monde.
you misname an object, it is adding to the misfortune of the world.
Comme le disait donc Albert Camus.
As said by Albert Camus.
Or, on l'a vu, le PCB de l'accusation.
And we have seen that the PCB of the prosecution is an accumulation of statements in which they misname things. They misname Seleka, they misname the government,
Elle nomme mal le conflit armé.
the policies,
Elle nomme mal les crimes de droit commun.
the armed conflicts, as well as the common law crimes that were perpetrated in Bangui. They also misname the role of the functioning of the OCRB and CEDAD, and lastly, they misname the role, or rather they mischaracterize the role played by Mr. Said. The objective of the prosecution is to transform the nature of the events, to transform or distort the reality in order to transform their allegations into international crimes. To try by all means, as the prosecutor is trying to do, to fit common law crimes into the category of international criminal justice is not only betraying the cause and nature of the International Criminal Court, but in the final analysis, it is what is more serious is to deny the reality of what the Central African population has been living for decades within the context of colonial and post-colonial violence, as we have already described. Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Nauri. Mr. President, I think we have a quarter of an hour left, and we will start with the presentation of Mr. Jacquemin, and in that way we can finish by 3 p.m. at the dot.
Thank you very much. You're allowed to do so. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Jacob.
Pas de conflit armé.
No armed conflict. no general policy,
pas de plan commun.
no common plan,
Ce n'est pas tout.
and that's not all.
Ensuite, d'appliquer le droit
In
pénal
addition
international
to applying international criminal law
à une situation qui
to
ne
a
s'y tient.
situation that does not lend itself to it,
Le procureur
the
fonde son
prosecutor
accusation
bases his accusation against Mr. Said
sur un empilement
on a
désordonné
disorganized series of events.
Il construit un récit fictif.
They are building a fictitious
Une hiérarchie
narrative
à l'OCRB.
as regards the hierarchy in the ORCB,
Hiérarchie
hierarchy
de laquelle
under which
se trouverait M. Saïd.
you can find Mr. Said.
Néanmoins,
Nevertheless,
ce récit ne résiste pas
this narrative
à l'analyse du PCB.
can be analyzed and is not correctly analyzed in the PCB.
Dans un premier temps,
Initially,
nous vous présenterons
we will
la
introduce
faiblesse probatoire
the evidentiary weakness of the elements used
au soutien des
to
événements
support the events
reprochés à M. Saïd.
of which Mr. Said is accused.
Nous nous baserons quasi
We
exclusivement
will base ourselves almost exclusively
sur les éléments contenus dans
on
le PCB.
the elements mentioned in the PCB.
Dans un second temps,
Then,
toujours sur la base des éléments
again,
fournis par le
on the
procureur,
basis of evidence provided by the prosecution,
nous découvrirons que
we will show you
dans ce Bangui 2013
that
chaotique,
in this chaotic Bangui of 2013,
la réalité de
the reality of OCRB
était celle d'un vide
was that
institutionnel.
it was an institutional vacuum,
Ainsi que celle
as well
d'une lutte
as a fight
contre la délinquance
against delinquency
et la criminalité.
and criminality.
Pour commencer,
In order to start,
concentrons-nous sur la
we will focus
faiblesse probatoire de l'accusation.
on the evidentiary weakness of the prosecution's argument.
À propos de l'OCRB,
As regards the OCRB,
l'accusation présente
prosecution presents 20 incidents.
c'est beaucoup.
That's a lot.
Sur ces 20 éléments,
Of those 20 incidents,
9
9
ne reposent
rely
un seul
on a
témoin.
single witness.
C'est beaucoup aussi.
That's also a lot.
4
Four
s'appuient
are
sur les
based
récits
on
de plusieurs témoins,
accounts of several witnesses
récits fortement discordants.
who are strongly conflicting in their narrative.
Enfin, 4
And
autres
finally, 4 others
rapportent des détentions
report detentions
effectuées sous contrôle
carried out
juridictionnel.
under judicial review.
À notre connaissance,
As far as we are aware,
aucun système moderne de droit pénal
no modern system of
n'accepte
criminal
de fonder
law
une accusation
accepts basing a charge on a single complaint,
sur un unique témoignage
on a single
non corroboré.
uncorroborated testimony.
Le procureur vous demande
The
de faire
prosecution
exception,
asks you to make an exception to this,
de vous affranchir
to move away
de la règle
from the rule
testis unus,
testis unus,
nullus.
testis nullus.
9 événements sont basés
9
sur un seul
incidents are based on a single
témoignage. Le
testimony.
procureur vous demande de
The
considérer
prosecution asks you to consider
une somme de rien
that a sum of
finit par
nothing
faire quelque chose
ends up making something
en
In this case,
une accusation sérieuse contre Monsieur Saïd.
a serious accusation against Mr. Said.
Une adaptation juridique
This is a legal and contemporary adaptation
de
of
calomnier,
slander.
il en restera toujours
Something
quelque chose.
will always remain.
L'événement A
Incident
basé
A
sur un seul témoignage,
is based on a single testimony,
P1165.
that of P1167.
L'événement C
Incident
n'est
C
basé que sur un seul
is based on
témoignage,
a single testimony,
celui de P0481.
that of P0481.
L'événement D
Incident
n'est basé que
D
sur un seul
is
témoignage,
based on a single
celui
testimony,
de
that of
P2682.
P2692.
L'événement F
Incident
n'est basé
F
que sur un seul
is
témoignage,
based on a single
celui de
testimony,
P0622.
that of P0622.
L'événement G n'est basé
Incident
que sur
G
un seul témoignage,
is also based on a
celui de
single testimony,
P0481.
that of P0481.
L'événement M
Incident
n'est basé que
M
sur un seul
is
témoignage,
based on a single
celui
testimony,
de P25.
that of 2519.
L'événement O aussi
Incident
n'est
O
basé que sur
is
un seul
also
témoignage,
based on a single testimony,
celui de
that of
P1737.
P1737.
L'événement Q
Incident Q
n'est basé que sur un
is
seul
based on
témoignage,
a single testimony,
celui de
that of
P2179.
P2179.
La liste se termine, rassurez-vous.
The list will end, I assure you. Incident
Qui
T,
rassemble plusieurs
which
occurrences.
collects several occurrences,
Pour chaque occurrence,
but for each
chacune ne
occurrence
se base que sur un seul
is
témoignage.
only based on a single testimony.
Au-delà de cette étonnante absence de rigueur,
Beyond this astonishing lack of rigor,
parce que différents témoignages
when
peuvent
different
être croisés
testimonies can be cross-checked
pour en vérifier la
to
véracité,
verify their veracity,
le procureur
the
occulte
prosecutor arrest of the soldier
a eu lieu
took
quelque
place
temps avant
some time
l'opération de
before
désarmement
the disarmament operation
contre
carried
l'OCRB.
out against OCRB Damala.
Fin de citation.
End of quote.
Or,
However,
cette opération
this operation
de désarmement
of disarmament
est datée
is dated
d'avril 2013.
April 2013 in paragraph 55 of the very same statement.
Voilà pour P2504.
That's as far as this witness is concerned.
Mais
But
le témoin P2607,
witness
quant à lui,
P2607,
est également
as far as
formel.
he is concerned, is also quite emphatic.
C'est le 27 juin
It is
2013
on the June
qu'a eu lieu
27,
l'arrestation.
2013 that this arrest took place.
ROTP 2127 95 27 paragraphe 15 et 16.
This is CAR OTP 2127-9257, paragraph 15 and 16.
Avant avril 2013,
Prior to April
le 27 juin
2013,
2013,
the 27th of June
d'autres
2013,
incohérences
other
existent.
inconsistencies existed between these accounts.
Le point le plus
But
troublant
the most troubling point of
concerne
concern
le décès
is the
du
death
soldat soi-disant
of
arrêté.
the soldier that was so-called arrested.
Ainsi,
Therefore,
d'après les preuves
according to the evidence
apportées par
provided
P2607,
by P2607,
principal témoin,
the main witness,
le décès du soldat
the death of the
aurait
soldier
eu lieu
took
le 27
place
juin 2013.
on the 27th of June 2013.
Ceci,
This,
d'après le certificat de
according
décès
to the death certificate
du 27 juin
of the
2013,
27th of June 2013,
portant un tampon
with a stamp
du 3 juillet
of
2013.
the 3rd of July 2013.
Car OTP
Car OTP 2116 0994.
Mais dès lors, que faire du
So,
certificat
what
de
about the
décès
death certificate
enregistré
registered
le 30
on
juin
the
2013?
30th of June 2013?
Car OTP
Car OTP
2116
2116
0992.
0992.
Il est d'autant plus difficile
It is all the more
décider
difficult to decide
entre ces deux certificats
between
de
these
décès
two death certificates
que P2607
because the
concède
2607
Il ne
concedes that he
aucun nom
does not know any name
sur le registre
on the
mortuaire
death register
présenté par les
presented by the investigators.
Car OTP
Car OTP 2127
9527
9527 paragraph 32,
qui mentionne
which
car
states
OTP
Car OTP 2044 0631.
Mr. Shackman, if you can conclude on this point, then I have to break. So if you have in a couple of minutes, if you can finish your reasoning on this point, then we'll continue after the break.
Entendu, Monsieur le Président.
That's very well, Mr. President.
Sur ce point,
On this point,
enfin et surtout,
and finally and most importantly,
dire du dossier
what do you
militaire
say about the soldier's military
qui
record
mentionne un décès
that
des suites de
talks about a death
Le 25
after illness of
2013.
the 25th of November 2013, Car OTP 2116 0995.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Well, okay, then thank you very much. I think you are left with some 38 minutes. So now I will break for lunch and we will see each other at 2:30 in the afternoon. Thank you very much. And a nice afternoon.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.